The air at the Hemlock Farm auction hung thick and heavy, a mix of diesel fumes, cheap cigar smoke, and the sweet, dusty smell of turned earth. It was April of 1968, a time when a man's worth was measured in acres and horsepower, and the future felt as wide and promising as the Iowa horizon. I was 26 years old, and my own future felt pinned under the weight of my father's legacy and the 200 acres of black dirt he'd left me, along with a warning that echoed in my head louder than any auctioneer's call. Debt is a chain, son. Don't ever let the bank forge you one. My name is Thomas Miller, and on that day, I was just another face in the crowd, my hands stained with the grease of a Farmall M transmission I'd been rebuilding all week. I wasn't there for the main event. I was hoping to pick up a used sickle bar mower, maybe some spare implement tires if the price was right. The main event was parked right in the center of the muddy farmyard, gleaming under the spring sun like a monument to a new religion. It was a John Deere 4020, fresh off the dealer's lot. It hadn't even seen a full season of work. Power shift transmission, diesel engine humming with a deep, confident rumble that made my old two-cylinder Johnny Popper sound like a coffee percolator. It had wide fenders, a padded seat, and a look of raw, unbridled capability. Men circled it slowly, like wolves sizing up a prize stag. They'd kick the massive rear tires, run a hand over the green paint, and talk in hushed, reverent tones about drawbar horsepower and hydraulic capacity. Holding court beside the tractor was Richard Harrison. Rich was my age, but he moved with the swagger of a man twice as successful. He'd just taken over his father's operation, a sprawling 800 acres down the river bottom, and he was doing it with the bank's money. He wore a brand new Pioneer seed cap, clean jeans, and a smirk that seemed permanently fixed to his face. "She's the future, boys," Rich announced to the circle of onlookers, patting the 4020's fender. "You can't scratch a living out of this dirt with museum pieces anymore. Time is money. You get in, you get the crop planted, you get out." His eyes swept the crowd and landed on me for a moment, a flicker of something between pity and contempt in his gaze. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Bill Gable, finally worked his way to the tractor. The chatter died. The air crackled. This was the moment the whole county had been waiting for. The bidding started high and climbed fast. It was a heavyweight fight, with 3 of the biggest operators in the county throwing haymakers of $100 bills. But Rich Harrison just stood there, arms crossed, that smirk never wavering. When the bidding slowed at $9,000, a staggering sum for the time, Rich finally stepped in. He didn't shout. He just raised a single finger. "10,000, he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. A collective gasp went through the crowd. $10,000. You could buy a small farm for that. The other bidders looked at each other, shook their heads, and stepped back. It was over. Bill Gable slammed his gavel. "Sold. For $10,000 to Mr. Richard Harrison." A wave of applause and impressed murmurs went through the crowd. Rich accepted the congratulations, like a king receiving his subjects. He was the future, and he had just bought its chariot. I turned away from the spectacle and made my way over to the rows of old, forgotten iron. That's where the real bargains were. I found what I was looking for, a rusty but solid-looking set of cultivators for my Farmall. The tines were worn, but the frame was straight. I could forge new points in my workshop. I was inspecting the lift mechanism when a shadow fell over me. It was Rich. He was holding 2 cold bottles of Coca-Cola, one of which he offered to me. I hesitated, then took it. "Celebrating?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Investing, Tom?" he corrected me, his eyes glancing from the gleaming År 2020 to the rusty cultivators I was examining. There's a difference? He took a long swallow from his bottle. Still playing with this old junk, I see. My grandpa had a set just like that. It'll still turn the dirt, I said, quietly, wiping a flake of rust from the frame. Rich laughed, a short, sharp sound. Sure it will. But how many acres can you cover in a day? 5? 10? I'll have 200 acres of corn in the ground before you're done with your first 40. You can't feed the world with rust and sentiment, Tom. The game has changed. The game is the same as it ever was, I replied, meeting his gaze. You put seed in the ground, you pray for rain, you hope for a good price, and you try to keep what you earn. No, you leverage what you have to get more. He shot back, his voice hardening. You use the bank's money to make your own. That's how you get ahead, staying small, staying debt-free. That's not being safe. It's just a slow way of going out of business. He gestured with his bottle toward my own farm, just over the hill. Your dad was a good man, Tom, a hard worker. But he thought small. Don't make the same mistake. He finished his drink, set the empty bottle on a fence post, and clapped me on the shoulder. Good luck with your project, he said, the word dripping with condescension. Then he walked back to his new tractor, the undisputed king of the auction, leaving me alone with the rust and the silence. I didn't buy the cultivators. His words had soured the deal for me. I just got in my old Ford pickup and drove home, the sound of my truck's tired engine a stark contrast to the powerful purr of that 4020. I could feel the eyes of the other farmers on me as I left, and I knew what they were thinking. There goes Tom Miller. Still living in the past, still trying to farm like his old man. Now, before we go any further in this story, I have to ask you all a question. Thinking back to that time, or maybe to stories your own fathers and grandfathers told you, who did you think was right? Have you ever known a man like me who stuck to his guns when everyone else called him a fool? Or maybe you knew a rich, a man who flew high and fast on borrowed wings, convinced he had the world by the tail? Let me know down in the comments which man you would have bet on back there in the spring of '68. The weeks that followed that auction settled into the familiar rhythm of spring planting. For Rich Harrison, it was a symphony of power and efficiency. From my Northfield, I could hear the deep-throated roar of his 4020 from sunup to sundown. He was pulling a 6-row planter, a piece of equipment so wide it looked like it could plant half the county in a single pass. The diesel haze from his exhaust pipe was a constant smudge on the western horizon. He was a force of nature, a one-man army of progress. My own spring was a different story. It was a duet between man and machine, a slow, grinding waltz with the past. My primary tillage tractor was my father's 1948 Farmall M. It was a good, honest machine, but it was no 4020. There was no power steering. After 10 hours of wrestling that big wheel, my shoulders and back would scream with a fire that seeped deep into my bones. There was no cab. I ate dust all day long, my face caked in a gritty mask of black soil by lunchtime. Starting it on a cold April morning was a ritual in itself. You had to set the choke just so, pull the starter rod, and pray you didn't flood the carburetor. The engine would cough, sputter, and then, if you were lucky, catch with a series of loud bangs that would eventually settle into a steady, rhythmic idle. The smell was a mix of gasoline, hot metal, and the faint, sweet scent of engine oil. To me, it was the smell of self-reliance. To most everyone else, it was the smell of obsolescence. For planting, I used Dad's other tractor, a 1952 John Deere Model A, the Johnny Popper. Its two-cylinder engine had a distinctive, syncopated rhythm, putt-putt, putt-putt, that you could hear from a mile away. It was a sound that was rapidly disappearing from the American heartland. I was pulling a 4-row planter, and every time I had to stop to refill the seed and fertilizer boxes, I'd look over at Rich's ever-expanding fields of freshly turned dirt and feel a pang of something I didn't want to admit was envy. The scorn from the community wasn't always overt, like Rich's comments at the auction. Most of the time, it was more subtle. It was the way the old-timers at the co-op would stop talking when I walked in. It was the friendly but pitying advice from the feed salesman. "Tom, you know, a new tractor would pay for itself in fuel savings alone, and the dealer's offering great financing terms right now." One day, the inevitable happened. I was cultivating my first-year corn, the young plants just a few inches high, delicate green shoots against the black earth. The Johnny Popper was chugging along, the sun was hot on my back, and I was lost in the hypnotic rhythm of the work. Then, without warning, the engine coughed, sputtered, and died. Silence descended on the field, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of Rich's 4020. I climbed down and went through the checklist. Fuel? The tank was half full. Air? The filter was clean. That left spark. I pulled one of the plug wires, held it against the engine block, and cranked the flywheel by hand. Nothing. Not a hint of a spark. I knew immediately what it was. The magneto. The heart of the old tractor's ignition system. There was no calling a mechanic. That was a luxury I couldn't afford, and a matter of pride I wouldn't allow. I walked the half-mile back to the farmhouse, got my toolbox, and walked back. The sun beat down, and sweat dripped into my eyes as I unbolted the Wico magneto from the side of the engine. It was heavy, coated in a half-century of grime. Back in my workshop, a place that smelled of cold steel, oil, and damp earth, I began the delicate surgery. I carefully removed the cover, exposing the intricate guts of the device. The points were pitted and corroded. I took them out and gently filed them flat and smooth with a fine ignition file, checking the gap with a feeler gauge until it was precisely 20,000ths of an inch. I cleaned the impulse coupling, a clever spring-loaded mechanism that gave the magneto a hot spark at low cranking speeds. I checked the condenser with my old multimeter. It was weak. That meant a trip to town. The John Deere dealership was a palace of glass and green paint. New tractors and combines sat on the showroom floor like idols in a temple. I walked past them, my greasy work clothes feeling out of place, and went to the parts counter. The kid behind the counter, barely out of high school, gave me a blank look when I asked for a condenser for a Model A. He had to blow the dust off a thick, ancient-looking parts catalogue to find the number. "We might have one in the back," he said doubtfully. After 10 minutes, he returned with a small, dusty box. It was the last one they had. As I was paying, the dealership owner, a man named Henderson, saw me. "Having trouble with that old Popper, Tom?" he asked, a little too cheerfully. "You know, I could put you in a brand new 30R20 for a very reasonable monthly payment. We could have you back in the field this afternoon." "Just keeping the old one honest, Mr. Henderson," I said, taking my part. "She's not ready for the scrap heap yet." He just shook his head and smiled that same pitying smile I was getting so used to. It took me the rest of the day to get the magneto reassembled, installed, and timed correctly. It was a frustrating process of trial and error, turning the flywheel to the timing mark, listening for the telltale click of the impulse coupling. Finally, as the sun was setting, I climbed back into the iron seat, took a deep breath, and pulled the starter rod. The engine spun, coughed once, and then roared to life with a series of sharp, authoritative bangs. The put-put, put-put, settled into its familiar, comforting rhythm. A wave of profound satisfaction washed over me. I had faced the problem, diagnosed it, and fixed it with my own 2 hands. I hadn't paid a mechanic, and I hadn't gone deeper into debt. As I drove the tractor back to the shed in the twilight, I saw the headlights of Rich's 4020 finally switch off in the distance. He had probably cultivated 80 acres that day. I had cultivated 10, but my tractor was running, and my farm was my own. In the quiet of that evening, that felt like a victory. The years began to stack up, one season bleeding into the next. The late 60s flowed into the early 70s, and the world changed. But on my farm, things stayed much the same. The Farmer M still needed a shot of ether to start on a cold morning. The John Deere A still popped and banged its way through the corn rows. I kept my machinery patched and painted, my fences tight, and my books balanced. I was making a living, not a killing. I was surviving. For Rich Harrison, those years were a meteoric rise. He farmed with an aggression I'd never seen, pushing the land and his equipment to their absolute limits. The 4020 was just the beginning. The real change came in 1972. The news trickled down to us through the farm radio reports and the chatter at the grain elevator. The Soviet Union, facing a massive crop failure, had agreed to buy millions of tons of American grain. Overnight, the price of corn, which had hovered around $1.25 a bushel for years, shot past $2, then $2.50. By 1973, it was flirting with $3. A wave of euphoria, a kind of gold rush fever, swept through the Midwest. Farmers who had spent their lives just getting by were suddenly, on paper at least, rich. No one rode that wave higher than Rich Harrison. His high-leverage, high-production model, which had seemed reckless just a few years before, now looked like pure genius. With corn prices tripled, the massive payments on his loans were suddenly manageable, even trivial. The bank, which once seemed to hold his fate in its hands, was now his biggest cheerleader, begging him to borrow more. And he did. He traded the 40-20, now considered old news, for a brand-new international harvester, 1466. It was a monster, a red beast with a turbocharged engine that screamed like a jet. It had a fully enclosed cab with air conditioning, tinted glass, and a radio. While I was choking on dust and sweating through my shirt, Rich was sitting in a climate-controlled bubble, listening to the radio as he worked twice the ground in half the time. He used the new tractor and a new line of credit to buy more land. Old Man Hemlock's place, the site of the auction, came up for sale again, and Rich bought it without blinking, paying a price per acre that made the old-timers gasp. Then he bought the 80 acres to the south of me and the quarter section to the west. My 200-acre farm was becoming an island in the middle of the Harrison Empire. He built a new, sprawling, ranch-style house on a hill overlooking the river, with a big picture window that looked out over his domain. The community, which had once watched him with skepticism, now treated him like a prophet. At the diner, the other farmers would hang on his every word, asking his advice on fertilizer rates and seed varieties. He was the golden boy, the man who had seen the future and bet the farm on it. And now he was cashing in. My own farm was doing well too. Those high grain prices made for a few comfortable years. The checks from the elevator were bigger than any my father had ever seen. My wife, Sarah, a practical woman who had stood by me through all the lean years, started dropping hints. "Tom," she said one evening as we sat on the porch, "the Petersons just got a new Ford tractor. It's not even that big, but it has power steering. Maybe we could look at one?" I knew where she was coming from. She saw the way I limped into the house after a long day, my hands so stiff I could barely hold a fork. She saw the new cars and remodeled kitchens of our neighbors. "We have one more payment on the mortgage, Sarah," I told her, taking her hand. "Just one more. After that, this place is ours. Free and clear. No banker, no finance man can ever take it from us. Let's get that done first. Then we'll see." And that's what we did. In the fall of 1974, I walked into the Farmers and Merchants Bank and wrote the final check on the loan my father had taken out 30 years before. I was 32 years old, and I owned my farm. Every acre, every building, every rusty bolt on every old machine. It was all mine. There was no grand celebration. I just shook the bank president's hand, walked out into the autumn air, and felt a quiet, profound sense of peace. Instead of buying new iron, I used the profits from the boom years to improve what I had. I put thousands of feet of clay tile into my low-lying fields, draining the swampy spots that had plagued my father for decades. It was back-breaking, muddy work, but it was a permanent improvement. I was investing in the soil, not in steel. I rebuilt the engine on the Farmall M, putting in new sleeves, pistons and bearings. I gave it a new coat of paint. It ran better than it had in 20 years. To the rest of the county, I was a fool, a man who had been handed the winning lottery ticket and had used it to buy sensible shoes. The whispers at the co-op were louder now. "Miller's got his place paid off, you hear. Could have doubled his acreage, but he just buried the money in tile. Too scared to take a chance. Never amount to anything." Rich would drive by my place in his new Ford F-250, the 1466, parked gleaming in his machine shed behind his new house. He'd give me a little wave, the kind you give a child or a simpleton. It was a wave that said, "I tried to tell you, but you just wouldn't listen." One cold afternoon in late November, I was at the bank depositing the last of the checks from the harvest. The lobby was quiet. I could hear the bank president, Mr. Abernathy, on the phone in his office, his voice low and strained. The door was ajar, and I caught a few words as I waited for the teller. "The prime rate is what? 12%. Good Lord, Paul. How are my farmers supposed to service their debt at those numbers? This Volcker fellow in Washington. They say he's serious about breaking inflation, no matter the cost." Abernathy's voice was filled with a dread I had never heard from him before. I finished my transaction and walked out into the sharp winter air. Across the town square, the lights of the International Harvester dealership blazed, illuminating a row of brand-new tractors. A huge banner was strung across the front window. "Buy now, pay later, easy financing for 1975. I looked at the banner, then up at the sky. The sun was shining, but the clouds on the horizon were a dark, bruised purple. A storm was coming. I didn't know when it would hit or how bad it would be. But standing there, with my deed in my pocket and my farm free and clear, I felt a grim certainty. When the rain finally came, I would be on high ground. I wasn't so sure about my neighbors. The storm I had sensed in 1974 didn't break all at once. It crept in like a slow fever. For a few more years the prices held, not high, but high enough to keep the illusion alive. The banks kept lending, and men like Rich Harrison kept borrowing, convinced the $3 corn was just around the corner. But the costs were rising. Diesel fuel, which had been 28 cents a gallon when Rich bought his Forte to 20, was now pushing $1. A new set of 16-ply tires for his 1466 cost more than my father had paid for our John Deere A. The interest rates on his operating loans, the money he borrowed each spring for seed and fertilizer, ticked up relentlessly, from 8% to 10%, then to 12%. They were small bites at first, but they were taking bigger and bigger chunks out of his margin. The first real sign of trouble came not from the bank, but from the sky. The summer of 1977 was brutal. A high-pressure dome settled over the Midwest and refused to move. The rain simply stopped. Day after day, a merciless sun baked the fields. The corn, which should have been shoulder-high by July, stood stunted and yellow, its leaves rolling up tight as cigars to conserve what little moisture was left. The ground cracked open in deep, thirsty fissures. From my porch I could see the heat shimmering off Rich's vast fields, the air thick with the smell of scorched earth and dying crops. My own fields were suffering too, but not as badly. The tile I had laid years before wasn't just for draining wet spots. It helped the soil hold moisture deeper, longer, and because I still used my old cultivators instead of spraying herbicides, the tilled soil created a dust mulch that slowed evaporation. They were small things, the old ways, but in a summer like that, they made a difference. One afternoon, I was in my workshop, rebuilding the water pump on the Farmall M. It was a simple job, a new seal and a gasket, costing all of $5. As I worked, I heard the distinctive high-pitched whine of Rich's 1466, followed by a sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was a sharp, metallic scream, then a series of violent, grinding crunches, and then, abruptly, silence. It was the sound of a very expensive machine dying a very violent death. I wiped my hands on a rag and walked to the edge of my property. Across the fence line, in the middle of his parched, withered field, the big red tractor sat motionless. A plume of black smoke curled from under the hood. Rich was just climbing down from the cab, his movement stiff and slow, like an old man. He took off his cap, threw it on the ground, and kicked one of the massive rear tires with a cry of pure, unadulterated rage that carried across the dead, still air. I knew what that sound meant. He'd thrown a rod or seized the engine. The turbocharger, which forced air into the engine to create its immense power, ran incredibly hot. In this heat, with that much strain, something had let go. This wasn't a magneto you could fix on the tailgate of a pickup. This was a catastrophic failure. The dealer's service truck was out there for the next 2 days. They had a crane to pull the engine. I watched from a distance as they worked under the punishing sun. The word at the co-op was that the repair bill was over $8,000. It was money Rich didn't have. To pay it, he had to sell off his herd of feeder cattle early, taking a loss on every head. The first crack had appeared in the empire, and it was a big one. He got the tractor running again, but he lost 2 critical weeks of the growing season, and his swagger was gone. When I saw him in town, his face was drawn and pale, his eyes holding a new, hunted look. The smirk was gone, replaced by a permanent, worried frown. The final blows came in the winter of 1979 and the spring of 1980. First, the Federal Reserve, under a man named Paul Volcker, jacked up interest rates to fight inflation. The prime rate, the number that dictated everything else, soared to 15, then 18, then an unthinkable 20%. Loans that had been manageable were now crushing. An operating note for $50,000 now carried $10,000 in interest alone for a single year. Then, in January, President Carter announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union in response to their invasion of Afghanistan. Our biggest customer was gone. The bottom fell out of the market. Corn prices didn't just drop, they collapsed, plummeting to below $2 a bushel, less than what it cost most high-input farmers to grow it. That was the tipping point. The whole fragile structure, built on cheap credit and high prices, came crashing down. Land values, which had been bid up to $3,000 or $4,000 an acre, were suddenly worth half that. Farmers who had borrowed against their equity woke up to find they were underwater, their debts far exceeding the value of their assets. The phone calls from the bank started. At first they were concerned, then they were firm, then they were final. The first foreclosure notice in our township was tacked to the courthouse door in the fall of 1981. The Miller place. Not mine, but my cousins, who had tried to keep up with the Harrisons of the world. Then came the Jensens, then the McGregors. It was a plague. Every week, another family we'd known our whole lives was being sold out. Their names read like a roll call of the county's history. The farm auctions became weekly events, but they weren't celebrations of success anymore. They were funerals. I went to Rich Harrison's auction in the spring of 1982. It was held on the same spot as the Hemlock auction 14 years earlier. But the mood could not have been more different. A cold, grey drizzle fell from the sky, soaking the small crowd that had gathered. There was no festive chatter, only hushed whispers and the mournful cry of the auctioneer. The machines were lined up, the monuments to Rich's ambition, now looking tired and forsaken. The paint on the 1466 was faded and chipped, the cab glass was cracked, and a film of oily grime covered the engine. It looked like what it was, a machine that had been run hard and put away wet, its owner too broke and too heartbroken to care for it properly. It sold for a fraction of what he had paid. Rich was there, standing beside his wife near the porch of the big ranch house he was about to lose. He was a hollowed-out version of the man I once knew. His shoulders were slumped, his face was gaunt, and he stared out at the proceedings with dead eyes, as if watching a film of someone else's life falling apart. The bankers, men in dark suits and city shoes that were getting ruined in the mud, stood off to one side, clipboards in hand, their faces impassive. I didn't stay for the whole thing. I couldn't stand to watch them sell his household goods, the furniture and the family pictures. It felt obscene. I saw the banker from Des Moines, a man named Thompson, who had replaced old Mr. Abernathy, making notes, his expression cold and clinical. To him, this wasn't a family's tragedy. It was just numbers on a ledger, assets being liquidated. During those years, I survived. With no debt, my cost of living was my property taxes, my groceries, and the fuel it took to run my old tractors. I wasn't making money, but I wasn't losing it either. The low grain prices hurt, but they didn't kill me. My old skills, the ones Richard called obsolete, were now my salvation. When the carburetor on the Farmall M needed rebuilding, I did it myself for the price of a kit. When the Johnny Popper's clutch began to slip, I split the tractor in my own shop, replacing the plates over a weekend. My neighbors, their lines of credit cut off, couldn't afford the dealer's $500 minimum service call. They started coming to me. First, it was Carl Jensen, his voice thick with shame, asking if I could look at the hydraulics on his Oliver. Then it was Mark Peterson, asking if I knew how to retime the injector pump on his Massey Ferguson. I never charged them more than the cost of the parts, and sometimes, if I knew things were really bad, I'd just tell them to pay me back when they could. Our currency became favors and shared labor, the way it had been in my grandfather's day. We were a community again, bound not by prosperity, but by shared hardship. I was busy, my workshop lights often burning late into the night. It wasn't vindication. It was just what a neighbor does. The climax, the moment that truly defined it all for me, didn't happen in a bank lobby or at an auction. It happened on a cold March morning, a few weeks after Rich's sale. I was walking my west fence line, checking for winter damage, when I saw him. He was standing on the other side of the fence, on the 80-acre plot that had been his grandfather's original homestead, It was the only piece of land the bank hadn't taken because it was still in his deceased grandmother's name and tangled in probate. But that was a temporary reprieve. The bank was working to unravel it, and Rich knew it. He was just standing there, looking at the old barn, its roof sagging like a tired old horse. I walked over to the fence. He didn't look at me, just kept his eyes on the barn. "My granddad built that barn in 1922, he said, his voice raspy. "Used oak timbers he cut himself from down by the river. Said a man's buildings should last longer than he does." We stood in silence for a few minutes. The wind cut through my coat. "They're taking it next month," he said, finally looking at me. The bravado was gone. The pity, the condescension, all of it was stripped away. All that was left was a man who had lost everything. "The lawyers say it's a done deal. I'll be gone by planting time." I looked at him, at the raw pain in his eyes, and I didn't feel an ounce of triumph. I just felt a profound sadness. He hadn't been a bad man, just an arrogant one. He'd been a believer in a new gospel of progress and profit, a gospel preached by the banks and the magazines and the government. He had just believed it more than anyone else. "I'm sorry, Rich," I said. And I meant it. I went home and talked to Sarah. We didn't have much. The crisis had been hard on us too, but we had our savings, the money we'd carefully put away during the good years, money we hadn't spent on new tractors or a bigger house. It was our security, our buffer against the world. The next day, I put on my good Sunday coat and drove to Des Moines. I found the high-rise office building where the bank had its headquarters. I walked into the sterile, air-conditioned lobby and asked to see Mr. Thompson. He kept me waiting for an hour. When he finally saw me, he was dismissive, looking at my worn farmer's hands with disdain. "What can I do for you, Mr. Miller?" he asked, glancing at his watch. "It's about the Harrison home place," I said, my voice steady. "The last 80 acres. You're taking possession of it." "That is a confidential bank matter," he said coldly. "I want to buy it," I said. He leaned back in his leather chair and laughed. "With what?" "The price of corn is in the tank. Land values are shot. You farmers have no money." I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my passbook from the local savings and loan. I slid it across the vast mahogany desk. It showed our life savings. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was real. It was cash. He opened it. His eyebrows shot up. He looked at the balance, then at me, then back at the balance. For the first time, he saw me not as a broke farmer, but as a potential customer. Cash was king in those days, and he knew it. "This is the appraised value of the land," he said, scribbling a number on a notepad. "Take it or leave it." It was almost everything we had. It would leave us with next to nothing in reserve. I thought of my father's warnings. I thought of Sarah and the risk I was asking her to take. But then I thought of Rich, standing by that fence, looking at his grandfather's barn. "I'll take it," I said. The paperwork took a week. When it was done, I owned the Harrison home place. I drove out there with the deed in my pocket. Rich was loading the last of their personal belongings into a small U-Haul trailer hitched to a beat-up station wagon. He looked up as I pulled in, his face a mask of weary resignation. He thought I was there to tell him to get off my land. I walked up to him and handed him a piece of paper. It wasn't the deed. It was a single-page lease agreement I had typed up on Sarah's old typewriter. "What's this?" he asked, his voice suspicious. "It's a lease," I said. "It gives you the right to farm this 80, to live in this house, for as long as you want. The rent is $1 a year. You pay the property tax and you keep the place up. That's the deal." He stared at the paper, then at me. He couldn't comprehend it. "Why?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "After everything, the way I treated you, why would you do this?" "Because that barn your granddad built deserves to have a Harrison looking after it," I said, "and because no man should have to watch his family's history get sold off on the courthouse steps, not if his neighbor can help it." Tears welled up in his eyes. He tried to speak, but no words came out. He just stood there, this man who had once been the king of the county, and he wept. He reached out and shook my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. And in that handshake, 14 years of rivalry and bitterness washed away, leaving behind something new, something that felt a lot like grace. Life found a new rhythm after that. The 1980s were lean, but the worst was over. The community slowly began to heal. Rich and I became unlikely friends. He farmed that 80 acres with a quiet intensity I'd never seen in him before. He used old second-hand equipment he bought for cash and kept running himself. We'd help each other during harvest, sharing labor and machinery. He taught my son how to weld a straight bead, and I helped him overhaul the engine on his old Alice Chalmers. We never talked about the boom years or the bust. We didn't have to. I never got rich. I never farmed 1,000 acres. But my son, David, came back to the farm after college. He loved the land, and he had my father's caution in his blood. He also had a new way of looking at things. He convinced me to try no-till farming on some acres, to plant cover crops to build up the soil. He respected the old ways, but he wasn't trapped by them. One crisp autumn evening, years later, David and I were in the shop. He was a young man then, his hands already showing the calluses of a farmer. We were working on the old John Deere. It needed a new set of rings, and I was showing him how to measure the cylinder bore. The familiar smell of gasoline and old iron filled the air. "Dad," he said, wiping his hands on a rag, "why did you keep these old things all those years, when everyone else was buying new? Weren't you ever tempted?" I stopped what I was doing and looked at the old tractor, its green paint worn smooth by decades of work. I thought of the auction in '68, of Rich's condescending smile, of the long, dusty days, and the quiet satisfaction of a repair done with my own hands. I thought of the foreclosure notices and the hollowed-out faces of my neighbors. "These machines taught me a lesson your granddad tried to teach me," I said, placing a hand on the tractor's cool metal hood. "It's not about how much horsepower you have in the shed. It's about how little you owe the bank. It's not about how many acres you farm, but how well you take care of the ones you've got. This tractor, it doesn't represent the past, son. It represents freedom. The freedom to make it through the storm." Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. From over the hill I could hear the faint, familiar put-put, put-put of Rich's old two-cylinder as he finished up his last round of fall tillage. It was a sound that had once been a symbol of obsolescence, but now, in the quiet of the evening, it sounded like the steady, resilient heartbeat of the land itself. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that we had survived. We had held on. And that was a victory greater than any harvest.